Try this again. Good morning. My name is John Diaz, Assistant Professor and Extension Specialist in the Department of Ag and Communications. And today's webinar is entitled Connecting Program Objectives to Evaluation Techniques. So first off, what is the purpose of educational objective? Some of you guys might already know this, but it's kind of good to refamiliarize yourself with what it is that objectives do to help to reorient you with why they're important. So objectives are really the main point are to provide direction in what your program will look like. Essentially, by using objectives to identify what you want your program to do and what your learners are going to do, it allows you the opportunity to be able to strategically select and provide and design learning experiences for those learners to get them to learn what they need to do so they can carry out the specific actions that you want to see them do. Without clear defined objectives, it's really impossible to organize your learning activities because you don't really have a clear understanding of what you want each program, small p, to do, and what you want your learners to be able to do. For me, the objectives are really pivotal and central to be able to provide a basis for evaluation. By identifying what you want your learners to be able to do, then you can develop evaluation tools and instruments that are able to actually measure what those outcomes are. And then also it's able to allow you to make decisions and predictions on what you want to do for your program and what you expect to happen. And if things are not occurring in the way that you want them to happen, you can make proactive remedial actions to improve the delivery of your program. So there's a lot of different information sources that you can utilize to help to craft your objectives. And this is essentially a linkage to the needs assessment. But there's a lot of ways in which you can collect the data to help to better inform your objectives. So you can do them through observations of the learners to try to figure out what their educational needs or what the issues are that they're struggling with. You can interview key stakeholders and your potential audience to have a conversation on what your program can do, again, what needs they're dealing with, and where they want to take their lives and themselves and their communities so that your program can position itself to help to move the needle forward. Questionnaires or surveys are another option, and then tests. Tests are really a helpful tool to understand knowledge and skills of your audience, so you can really orient your program to help to build those areas by utilizing some sort of assessment to quantitatively understand where those gaps exist. You can also just observe contemporary life or society. So for example, you can walk around and identify that there's a lot of folks in your community that are obese or struggling with different chronic disease. So, by triangulating all of these and conferring with your subject matter specialist or discipline through the literature, you're able to really get a holistic picture on what those objectives need to be to help to address a salient need within your community, the state, region, etc. So some of you all have already probably heard of the SMART construct, but just to kind of reinforce, this is a construct that's used within Extension to help to develop objectives that are really able to effectively guide your program. And SMART is an acronym that stands for specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. So the mantra is be specific in terms of target clients and the expected outcomes, state the outcomes in a measurable form. One of the things you want to make sure it's that they're actually achievable. So while you want to be ambitious, you want to do something that straddles a line of being ambitious and also realistic. It should also be relevant to the specific problem being addressed, and then should specify the time taken to accomplish the objective. So an example I provided on here is annually, at least 50% of homeowners who successfully completed the Florida-Friendly Landscaping Series will adopt at least one Florida-friendly best practice as measured by follow-up survey. So the time bound is annually. What we're measuring is the amount of our audience, 50%, that adopt at least one best practice. The 50% or the one best practice is what would be relevant and achievable, and then identifying what the practice would be would regard to specificity. So there's 3 different levels in which objectives can be created for an extension program. There's what's called immediate, intermediate, and long-term outcomes. Immediate outcomes really center around what you would expect right after a workshop or activity. So this deals with knowledge, attitudes, skills, and aspirations. And as educators, this is really the part that we have the most control over. Because once someone removes themselves from the program and moves towards the immediate outcomes of behaviors and practices, there's external factors and other things that are at play that may reduce the likelihood of actually carrying forward that action that you're looking for. There's also long-term outcomes that deal with the social, environmental, and economic conditional changes that your program may create. But for the purposes of this presentation, we'll focus on the first two, and those are really the ones that you want to focus within your ROA or your plan of work, so that you're able to effectively evaluate those components that you have the most influence over, and then try to extrapolate how those differences or those changes may have influenced social, environmental, and economic changes. So some of you have heard small p versus large p. What does that mean? Well, we'll go over what that means in a little bit more granularity, but really the difference between small p and large p is small p is your overarching program. So all of your activities will feed into the large P. And the small p are the specific activities. So for example, if you had a composting workshop or a youth development field trip, or just some of those individual activities, those would be the small p. And I'll go through on what an objective looks like for the large P and the small p, because both are very important. The small p, again, will be what you would put in your packet, and the small p would be what you would utilize to help to make decisions on how you design your program and what you would do to evaluate it to report it under that larger P. So we'll go ahead and start it with learning objectives. So these are just some examples. I like to provide examples because it gives you an idea of what it looks like within the actual context of a program. So the first one is within the context of the FFL program. So at least 75% of program participants will report increased knowledge of at least one Florida-friendly landscape practice directly following a program activity as measured by retrospective pre and post. So as you can see, this is really overarching, talking about best practices within FFL, and it doesn't really delineate what the program activity is. And this is important for your packet because your program activities may vary. There may be several program activities that feed into the adoption of one best practice. So you want to make sure that you're as specific as you can be, but be somewhat overarching so you don't have to create a new objective for every activity. The small B objective would be more specific. At least 75% of program participants will report increased knowledge for identifying native plants directly following the native plants workshop as measured by retrospective pre-post test. So as you can see, this is a lot more specific, and it actually identifies the workshop that you would be expecting to see this level of increase in knowledge within your participants. So you'd want that small p to feed into the larger P that deals with an FFL practice. We'll keep moving forward. So this one's within the ag context. And as you can see, there's a lot of the same scaffolding within this one. So report knowledge of at least one ag BMP following a program activity, which morphs into increased knowledge of conducting soil tests to identify fertilizer needs directly following the fertilizer workshop as measured by retrospective. So you can see by that difference, you have a clearer picture of what exactly you're expecting to see from your audience. And then you can understand how to develop a survey to do that. So you're wanting them to report either an increase of knowledge with soil tests or increase in knowledge of soil tests as they relate to identifying fertilizer needs. All right, so another example, and there's going to be some more examples that'll walk through different program areas. So again, with this one, same scaffolding, 75%, retrospective pre-post tests, at least one essential element of positive youth development following a program activity. So this is for the 4-H agents. And then how this would transfer to a small p objective. So it's the same scaffolding, but in this one, you're looking for increased knowledge for creating a safe, inclusive environment. And we identify the actual activity, which would be the Club Climate webinar. So again, this is a level of granularity that will help you better understand how to design your program and what you're looking for specifically as far as evaluation goes. All right, so here's an FCS example, same essential scaffolding. We have on this one at least one healthy living best practice directly following a program activity. And that one, the specificity of that one is increased knowledge for using healthy cooking techniques directly following the Cook Smart, Eat Smart series. So as you see, one is more broad so that you're able to feed these small P objectives into it and not have to create a long set of objectives for those that are reviewing your packet, whether it's a DED or an external reviewer, having to sift through all of those. So I'm going to go ahead and take a really quick pause for questions. We've only gone over the immediate outcome objectives, but as you can see, there's a difference in the small p and large p objectives, and you want to make sure, regardless if it's a small p or a large p, that you adhere to the SMART construct, because it provides the level of detail that you need and the reviewer would need to understand what you would do for program delivery, but then also how you would evaluate success. So I'll go ahead and stop talking. If you have any questions, just type Q into the chat, and I will call on you as you put that in there. Tia, go ahead.
Yeah, I was wondering about the pre and post survey. Do you include that in one survey, or do you do two separate surveys?
Yeah, so if you'll see on the objectives that I created, I called it the retrospective pre-post. I am not a big fan of over surveying our audience because, generally speaking, I think extension clientele are probably one of the most over surveyed audiences in the country. So by integrating it into just a post test, you're able to collect the baseline and the increase all at the same time without having to administer two surveys. So that's what I would recommend. If you do a long series-based program, it may make more sense to do the traditional pre-post if you're doing like assessment questions. So thinking of like midterm and final type questions, it's more conducive to do that. But if you're asking someone to reflect on their knowledge, I say only one, and it would be right after the activity is over.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? How about long-term outcomes? How to address in terms of reporting? Yeah, so as far as long-term outcomes, and that's not part of this presentation, but I'll kind of address it here. Long-term outcomes are something that takes a lot to be able to actually measure, because it's so much time removed from your program, and the people that engage in your program may no longer be where they were when they engaged with your program. It essentially takes a look of a research project. So what a lot of folks do in regards to demonstrating long-term outcomes is they make connections to the literature with what they're doing. So for example, if someone were to install an irrigation system, you could connect it to the literature that shows the amount of water savings that one would have by having a micro irrigation system installed, or whatever other best practices within 4-H. If you put in place the positive youth development practices, the literature shows by having that context, youth are put on the trajectory to thrive. So rather than collecting the data for long-term outcomes or impacts, you collect the knowledge gain and behavioral change and then extrapolate that to the impact based on what the literature says, or what is reasonable to think can happen based on that change in behavior. Did that answer your question? Yes. Okay. Nicole, go ahead.
Hey, Dr. Diaz. So quick question, when it comes to those specific, the small p objectives, I wanted to ask, what do you see in those reports? Like, I've got a couple of agents that there could be 7 or 8 different practices that, are all under one main objective, and they just report the outcomes for each of those practices. They don't literally have 7 or 8 different objectives listed in the report.
Right. So that's what I teach too, is having that overarching objective and then having a data table underneath to show how it breaks down to the different practices, topics, concepts that are taught. So rather than having 8 different objectives for 8 different practices, you have an overarching practice objective, and then you have those practices parsed out based on how many folks said that they adopted the practice, and what percentage of the audience was, so folks get an understanding both your ability to achieve your overarching objective and then what that looks like within the different practices. So from a planning standpoint, you would just append those small p objectives to your workshops, and then that would then help to feed into that secondary data table of practices, concepts, topics, etc.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Any other questions? Paloma, can you assess medium-term outcomes without first assessing short-term? Oh, most definitely. You can definitely assess medium-term without assessing short-term, but I would not recommend that. The reason is your short-term outcomes essentially serve as a milestone for your medium-term outcomes. So for example, if your audience is not achieving the change in knowledge or skills to be able to carry out a specific practice, if you wait until you are evaluating those medium term, it may be a little bit too late. So if you're evaluating those short-term knowledge-based outcomes and you see that you're not achieving the level of success that you want, you're able to make really quick proactive remedial actions of how you're delivering the program, and then make those changes before you have more folks in that program. So I always say, if you wait till behavior change, you may have 3 or 4 workshops that were completely unsuccessful, and you didn't know that until you actually measured practice adoption. So those short-term outcomes are really important to measure, so that you make sure that you have something in place to make changes and improve your program before it's too late. Any other questions? These are great. All right, so if you guys have any other questions, we'll have another pause, and if you could think about it, you can always ask them at that point. So now, since I had you guys kind of think through this, I want you all to create a large P objective and then connect it with a small P objective. What's going on here? Yep. With a small P objective, and then try to figure out what is the best technique to evaluate this outcome. And while you guys are doing that, I'll address VG's question. So it says, do you have suggestions for year-long programs? For example, diabetes prevention meets 16 times in a row, then tapers to once per month. Should we do knowledge gain eval somewhere in the first 16 weeks? How often? So with programs like Dining for Diabetes or diabetes prevention programs, it really depends on the retention rate that you have. A lot of folks will drop off before the end of the 16 weeks. So I typically recommend that folks do it after each concept or module or week, so you're able to at least collect that knowledge gain data. And then because it is a long program, you can also collect behavior change data within the context of the program. So you're able to do all of that without actually having to follow up. You can do it at that last workshop. All right, so I'll give you guys a couple minutes, and then I'll call on some folks for them to share their answers. And this is just to kind of wrap your head around before we go into the techniques. All right, give you guys another minute or so. All right. So do we have any volunteers that want to share? And if I don't get any volunteers, I will select folks at random. All right.
So,
Go ahead.
John, I can go.
Okay, Nelly, thank you.
Slash P, at least 75% of program participants will report increased knowledge of at least eating fiber 1 time per day as an activity program measured by retrospective pre and post tests. And the small p will be at least 75% of the program participants will report increased knowledge for identifying proteins directly from the MyPlate diet as a measure by retrospective pre and post tests.
Perfect.
Something
That's
like that.
That's great. That's great. So
Okay.
as you can see, Nelly's example had kind of the overarching construct, and then she got really into the MyPlate with that follow-up objective. So thank you for sharing, Nelly. Do we have anyone else that wants to share?
I'll go.
All right.
At least 75% of program participants will report increased knowledge of at least one healthy living practice directly following a program activity as measured by retrospective pre-post test. And the small p would be at least 75% of program participants will report increased knowledge for a healthy cooking technique directly following the healthy cooking series as measured by a retrospective pre-post test.
Awesome. That's great. We got either a question or someone who wants to volunteer. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. I wrote at least 75% of program participants will report increased knowledge of at least one aspect of pesticide licensing training from review classes measured by the retrospective pre-post test. And then the small p, at least 75% of participants will pass the core licensing test as shown by the testing scores reported.
Okay. So the one thing I'll say is the pesticide licensing program, is that the only program that you have within that program area, or are there multiple programs that are connected to that licensing series?
Well, from what I know so far, I'm really new, so
Okay.
you know,
Well,
we'll do like pesticide review classes and also offer CEU credit in some of those review classes, and some of those classes will also be including testing.
okay.
So that's kind of what I know so far about that.
Okay. What program area are you in?
Citrus.
You're a citrus agent? Okay.
Yes.
So you'd want to think about how the pesticide applicator series fits within the larger construct of managing citrus properly.
Okay.
I think that your small p objective would work, but you'd want to think about how pesticides fit within that larger construct, because if you do pesticides as one, and then you may have, you know, other kind of BMP type programs that then would require additional knowledge objectives. So well, I think your small p objective is really nice. I would try to think about what is more overarching that your pesticide classes could do it, your I don't know, your fertilizer, whatever other set of classes that you have would feed into that objective, and then that small p for your pesticide applicator would be good.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Yep. Mario, did you have a question, or do you want to share? Here we go. Mario's sharing in the chat box. So it says at least 50% of producers will implement at least one reproductive management technology in the coming breeding seasons as evaluated by annual surveys. And then it says at least 50% of producers will increase knowledge on protocols for estrus synchronization after a lecture program is evaluated by pre-post. So I think these are good. The only thing that you want to think about is your small p objective is a behavior objective, and your small p is a knowledge objective. So you want the knowledge to connect those two to be knowledge-based objectives.
Can you
So
repeat real quick, Dr. Diaz, your small p to be what, the behavior?
what was that?
What did you say I thought you said the small p was your behavior objective.
No, so the small p is your activity-based objective.
Okay.
So you can have a large and a small p for knowledge and a large and a small p for behavior. The small p is just at a level of detail greater than the large p because it's tied to a specific activity, where the large P is just overarching for all of your activities.
Okay.
So for Mario's, he would want to figure out what the larger concept of protocols for estrus synchronization. So maybe it's just understanding reproductive management best practices, and then this protocol would be kind of a detail within that. Does that make sense, Mario?
Yes, thank you very much, John.
Lisa, you have a question?
Yes, so I understand what you mean. Thank you for saying it that way, that we need a large P and a small p for knowledge, a large P and a small p for behavior. With a lot of the housing education classes, or all of them, we do the knowledge and behavior, and then we also collect the dollar impact value from the county or wherever people are getting funding as a result of the training.
Mm-hmm.
So large P, little p for that too. Is that, because
So
really
when you get to the impact, the large or the long-term impacts, it's really just kind of delineating what it is that you want to see, generally speaking. So I would imagine that it would only be a large P for your, you can put small p ones, but if you craft your objective the right way, it's regardless of whatever. So just dollars saved, for example, would be one. Increased profitability, whatever it is. I wouldn't necessarily put a small p objective for impact, because I would just want to get away from pigeonholing myself into it being just that activity. Does that make sense, Lisa?
well, yeah, because we've been, I mean, it's been part of my large P, outcome.
Right.
But I really like the table format, because we are collecting, did you reduce debt? Did you save more money? And then did you buy a house? Did you make any of these changes? Right. So there's a lot that we're collecting already.
And you could do it. I mean, you could do your overarching, let's say I'll use savings again, your overarching savings one, and then tie it to that program. But just because it's so far removed, it really, the only main difference would be the activity itself, and outlining that activity in the objective. So
and we don't,
I would say, yeah, go ahead, but I don't necessarily know if it's
well, what's different about it is we don't usually get that data from participants. We get it from the counties. So it sticks out, it's different.
right. So that'd be something we can talk through, Lisa. But I think that's a good best practice too. And rather than collecting data yourself, you're going to the county who's already collecting that data. So rather than reinventing the wheel and creating more work for yourself, you're just connecting with that group that's got it available. So that's a really good best practice.
Oh, thank you. Okay.
So I've got a question for Michael. It says, could a small p have both knowledge gained and immediate behavior change, and a big P have multiple behaviors adopted? So I'll address both of those. So for the question one, no. And the reason for that is, how are you to say you're successful with your objective if, for example, someone gained knowledge but then didn't change behavior? So you want to parse those out very cleanly, especially for reporting purposes, so that as you're reporting percentage of knowledge gained, you're able to make a close connection, and then behavior change, you can make that close connection as well. Yes, you can have a P for multiple behaviors. And so when you're crafting that objective, when you do percentages and the amount of behaviors, you would just ump the number. So maybe it's something like 30% of folks will adopt at least 2 best practices, or whatever that is. And then as you're reporting, you provide detail of what those best practices are. This is great. Any other questions? I appreciate everyone who shared.
I had kind of a question on the the next step, I guess, after when you're calculating all of the impacts and stuff of doing it in such a broad way. So you have the big overarching P, and then like for Florida Friendly, we have 9 principles. So we're doing workshops in all the varying categories.
Yep.
And so it's hard to say, you know, this large or impact when you're talking about mulch and compost and, you know, all these different topics right now, because I've kind of gone like big and then the little P's, all the different little P's for the various topics. I'm just kind of wrapping my head around how to collect all that as an impact where, you know, a lot of people do gallon save, but if you're focusing more on like, you know, fertilizer and, you know, compost and habitat, things like that, it's, I guess I'm skipping to the next step. So,
yeah. So, I mean, I think there's different ways you can do that. So like, for example, use the fertilizer example. Your impact could just be decrease in the overall amount of fertilizer used based on the amount of practice change that you're seeing within your audience. So if they say they're using 1 less bag of fertilizer per year, then you can extrapolate what that be as regards to how much less nitrogen or whatever within the system. So that's when you have to get creative and extrapolate and try to make calculations on, based on the extent of this behavior change, what does this mean for improved water quality or things of that nature. And you're even seeing that on the water quantity side where they're not asking for gallons of water saved, they're just asking for adoption of different practices. And then based on the literature, it says, well, if someone, for example, installed a micro irrigation system and used it at this frequency, then there's a reasonable and conservative expectation to think that they may have saved X amount of gallons of water. So that's how you would make it, and you would integrate that into your impact statements in your packet. Do you have any other questions as follow-up to that, Tina?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going a little bit more off on a limb. The other option I've thrown around is just like mentioning water in every single workshop and then just kind of using water conservation as like my de facto.
Right.
But that's not really ideal.
And that's why I usually tell folks to focus on the knowledge and behavior change, because again, that's what you have most influence on. I mean, I know FFL, they've got a large statewide survey that collects some of that data as well. So you could always send your participant list to them and have them collect that data for you. Yeah, there's not a perfect construct, especially for FFL, where there's so many different practices that are coming together within one program area.
Yeah, okay. No, it's good just to hear your opinion on it.
Got another question. Laura, John, can you please give an example of a small p versus a large p for 4-H? I feel all of our objectives are small p's. So I will go back to a previous slide where I did small versus large p for 4-H. Here we go. So I have the large P is increased knowledge of at least one essential element of positive youth development. And then the small p is increased knowledge for creating a safe and inclusive environment. So you've got a workshop that's specifically focused on that.
Thank you, John.
All right, any other questions before we move on? All right. So we had a question earlier from Tia in regards to, when do you administer your survey? And the first type of survey that I'll go over is the retrospective pre-post test. Really for this one, you want to consider the length of your program. If you've got an hour program, a couple hours, a half day, even a full day program, the retrospective really makes a lot of sense. And the question you want to ask yourself is, do you want your participants to fill out 2 surveys? I could not imagine holding a 1-hour webinar, for example, and having surveyed you all twice to figure out where your knowledge was before and where it is now. So just ask yourself that question and find out, is the retrospective what you need to report the data that you are looking for your ROA to measure the success for your program? So I'll give you guys a few examples of what the retrospective looks like. And Tina, this will resonate with you because this was actually pulled from one of your surveys. So this is a retrospective where they simply ask if their knowledge increased in each one of these areas. So I've learned how to calibrate, I've learned how to compost, I've learned how to apply fertilizer, I've learned how to manage pests responsibly, etc. So this is something you would just administer after a workshop, ask them to reflect on their knowledge, and utilizing that introduction above. If their knowledge increased, they said yes. If their knowledge did not increase, they said no. And if they missed the part of the workshop, because we know folks sometimes will come late or leave early, you have the opportunity to put an NA. And so as you saw with those objectives, it was all talking about reporting. And so this gives us the opportunity to measure a self-report within each one of these areas in a really seamless way. And Laura, this is just another example, and this is within the 4-H context. We created a post-workshop survey that broke down these different constructs. So you would have your participant go through and answer yes or no if they increase their knowledge in each of these areas. And if they missed it or you didn't cover it, then you have the opportunity to answer NA. So thinking about large P, you have your essential elements, and then these are, part of that construct, and you have the opportunity to, based on your workshop, identify which one of these constructs you want to measure. Here's just another example. This is a weed management program within ag, where they just wanted to ask folks on different components of managing their weeds within the forage and range land management construct. Here's another one. Lisa, you may recognize this from Cook Smart, Eat Smart. And this is what you would see as the traditional retrospective. So you see they ask for knowledge before the program and then knowledge after. This is a little bit different than what you saw before in the other ones. It gives you the same construct of rating, so it's a self-rating. The only implication for this one is it requires a little bit more rigorous analysis. You'd have to do a paired t-test rather than being able to pull the percentages straight from Qualtrics. Got a question. Go ahead, VG.
Using this example where you said it's the more traditional retrospective, would this be something that you would want to do if you think your participants will already come in with some sort of knowledge? So if I teach my plate, I might get a lot of no, I did not increase knowledge because they already had a basic understanding of it. But then using something like this would allow me to see if they increase knowledge, even if it was a slight amount, if they already knew something.
Right. So this gives you the opportunity to identify the level of knowledge increase. There are some good and bad because it is such a subjective measure. It's really hard to tell. Well, if someone went in as a 3 and now they're a 4, what does that really even mean? And what's the difference between slightly, moderately, and very versus extremely? So, it's not a perfect measure. It's very subjective, but you could also see, like you said, VG, if someone comes in and they thought they were very knowledgeable and now they're extremely knowledgeable, you still have a little bit more detail than you would have in that simple yes/no construct. So if you're willing to do the analysis on the back end, this will provide a little bit more detail for that type of audience. Got another question. Oh, no problem. All right, so now getting into reporting. So we had all these self-constructs, we had the objectives. We have at least 75% of 4-H volunteers will report increased knowledge of at least one positive youth development principle or practice directly following a program activity as measured by retrospective pre-post tests. So this is where we take that large P objective and report based on the overall amount of participants, how many folks responded to that retrospective, and what was our level of success overall in having our 4-H volunteers report increased knowledge of at least one PYD. And then as you can see, the secondary table is what would connect with those small P objectives. So you may have one for creating an inclusive environment, physically, emotional, safe space. So by having those objectives set up on the front end, it makes it a lot easier to report on the back end. So you, like Nicole asked, you wouldn't necessarily create new objectives. You would just have the secondary table that would be connected to those objectives so that you can provide a little bit more detail than what the top table has. And I just go through the examples. So it's the same thing with FFL. You have the overarching success and then what that looks like for calibrating sprinkler, right plant and replace, managing pests responsibly, etc. Knowledge, healthy living. So for my FCS agents, cooking meals at home, meal planning, family exercise. So as you can see through these, by doing those small p and large P objectives, this process becomes a lot easier. This one's ag, overarching ag, then you have IPM, weed ID and management, winter forages. So now looking at the idea of self-report versus an actual assessment. An actual assessment is really only relevant and needed when you have a series-based program. And as I mentioned earlier, this is what you would think of when you think of a midterm exam in school, where you're actually asking folks questions to measure their ability to identify things or answer questions correctly, where there's actually, in fact, a true right, wrong answer. So these questions are from a program that I work with, Cook Smart, Eat Smart, and it's leveraged before and after the program, where folks are asked to identify, for example, this first one, what is the correct method to arrange vegetables on the pan when roasting to reach best caramelization? So by doing this, you're actually able to understand if you have a true change in their knowledge because you're asking these types of questions and it's not a self-report. So the difference in objectives would be at least 75% of program participants will report increased knowledge of at least one healthy living practice directly following a program activity as measured by retrospective. Instead, you would look at something like at least 75% of series program participants will demonstrate a 30% increase of knowledge in healthy living habits directly following a program activity as measured by pre-post. So if you think about it where, maybe they went in and they got 50% of them right, and now they got 80% of them right, that would be part of this measure of success. They'd be counted towards that 75%. So you just put on your traditional teacher hat on and think about grading exams and what that would look like both for objectives and for actual evaluation. So if you've got different series that you think are going to be, or series-based programs are a core part of what you want to do, you want to make sure you delineate those objectives from just the traditional reporting objectives, because an assessment is very, very different than just reporting increases in knowledge. So another thing I want to consider in this whole idea of connecting objectives to evaluation techniques is the opportunity to utilize observation in the place of surveys to understand and measure knowledge application and skill development. So some of the things that you want to ask yourself is a survey appropriate? Are there tangible actions or behaviors that can be observed? And will observation impede on learning? And so, especially for that first question, within the 4-H context, surveys are a lot of times not appropriate just because the answers that you're going to get are not relevant, or if you're dealing with a non-English speaking audience, there's a lot of opportunities for disconnect in understanding the questions versus their actual attainment of knowledge. So if a survey is not appropriate and you actually have tangible actions that you'll see, and you doing the observation or others doing the observation won't get in the way, then you may want to consider observation as a tool to measure the success of your program. So some just examples of what are observable actions. So operate a computer record keeping program. So you can actually observe someone doing that. Discriminate between normal and diseased plants. So the way that it's written, it's not, you can't see someone internally discriminate between normal and diseased plants. So for a small p objective, you would maybe add an indicator of asking them to sort into two separate piles and observe their ability to sort normal versus diseased plants. Recall the procedure for printing a financial statement for their program record. So again, these are all small p objectives, but all very relevant. So covert, you'd have to add an objective. So by bringing a copy of a financial statement to the next class. Finally, circle each problem area in a financial statement. You can see that, and you can have someone submit it and evaluate if they're able to effectively do that. So I typically recommend that if you're doing this for the purposes of your ROA, you use structured observations where there are specific things that you're looking for, and you have a directed or preset guide to help to guide your ability to observe those different things. And by doing it this way, it provides standardized information. So if you want to use the same tool across different programs or activities, you can do that. And if you have volunteers or others that are doing observations for you, it ensures that they have the same structure, look for the same things that you would be. And by doing the structured observation, it gives you that numerical summary and the quantitative data that you would need and is important for reporting in your ROA. So some examples are, here is a soft skills evaluation tool that's used within 4-H. This gives 4-H agents the opportunity to observe the 5 C's of leadership development within their students at the beginning of a series-based program and towards the end. And so this tool was actually used within Hardy County, and so Jose Zayas, for his spin class, and he thought it was an effective tool to be able to actually measure knowledge and skill development within each one of these really effectively without using surveys. And then he actually used it as a tool to give advice to his students on how to advance their skills in each one of these different areas. So this is just one example of a tool. What does it look like in regards to reporting? So your objective may be at least 75% of youth participants will demonstrate improved soft skills within a program series as measured by trained observer rating. So you have maybe 100 participants, you'd have to observe 80, and you'd have 75% outcome attainment within that. And then you can break it out into each of the different practices that within that instrument. So communication, collaboration, conflict management, etc. So the question I always have is, how do you determine how many folks you have to observe? So the first point is, you don't have to observe everything. With observation, you would approach it the same way you would research. One of the tools that I use to determine how many folks that I need to observe is the sample size calculator. And they just simply ask for, what is your population? So for, let's say, 4-H, how many students would be in your program or in the club? And then based on the confidence level and the margin of error, it'll tell you what the sample size is. So the smaller your margin of error and the larger the confidence level, the larger your sample will need to be. So this would be something that you probably want to talk through with your district extension director to try to figure out what those numbers need to be for them to accept observation as a tool for you to use within your program area. I always say that as long as you have a confidence level of at least 75% in the context of program evaluation, that is a valuable tool and rigorous enough in my eyes for the purposes of an evaluation tool. So now that I've gone over retrospective, actual assessments, and the utilization of observation within the context of evaluation and those objectives, I want to take another pause for questions. So if anyone has any questions on what happened before the first pause or since then, just type Q into the chat and we'll go through those at this time. All right. Well, I don't see any questions, so I will keep plugging along. So now that we've gone over all the different components of measuring the immediate outcomes of knowledge gain, we'll talk about following up to measure practice change. This would be the same kind of thing, walking through what a large P objective would look like versus a small P objective. I'm using the same kind of program areas, so I'll just quickly go through these different examples. So annually, at least 45% of program participants will report adopting at least one FFL best practice as a result of engaging in a program activity as measured by follow-up survey. So the small P objective would just specifically identify what that practice would be. So planting native plants in their yard as a result of the native plant workshop. This next one, report adopting at least one ag BMP as a result of a generic program activity. And then for the follow-up, you'd look for them actually using a soil test results to guide fertile application as a result or a follow-up to the fertilizer workshop. Here's this one's report adopting at least one healthy living practice as a result of a generic program activity, and that changes to Cook Smart, Eat Smart participants will report cooking more meals at home as a result of the class. So my Cook Smart, Eat Smart folks will remember this item. And so this is a way to measure knowledge gain as it results to series-based programs. So as I mentioned to VG, if you do have a long series-based program, there's an opportunity at the beginning to find out where folks are in these different practices in the behavior change process. And then once that series is over, then you can go ahead and utilize this construct to see within the context of your series what behavior change was able to happen. I got a question. Go ahead, Tina.
So I was just curious, like I started with the numbers kind of lower, just not really knowing, but now that I'm getting some, feedback and getting those surveys back, would you recommend changing them, in the ROA to reflect like kind of what we're seeing more coming in?
Yep. So my philosophy on your ROA is it's a living document. And if you start to see, like, for example, you have a 25% practice adoption and you're hitting, let's say 50% constantly, you want to, for your purposes, move that number up just to increase your own personal ambition, but then show the reviewers that you're striving for a higher number based on the data that you're receiving and just utilizing that data to adapt your program and what you strive for. So yes. And the general rule of thumb is the larger percentages you'll see in knowledge gain, and then behavior change should be less, and then impact would be even less than that. Based on what I mentioned before, as someone removes themselves from the program, there's several different factors that'll come to play that will reduce their likelihood of adopting practices or saving water and so on and so forth. Kimber, go ahead.
Same thing a little bit on the numbers. I noticed that on your examples for small p and large p, you like 75% for large, 75% for small, 45%. Is there a reason behind that, or is that just kind of like your random selection?
Yeah, that's just for me a kind of a filler number. Really what you do to identify that number is you use your best judgment and your expertise as a 4-H agent and understand the different levels of complexity that may come into play. So for example, you see this a lot with refresher series. If you have a refresher series that's part of yours, you may know that you may not demonstrate the same level of knowledge gain that you would with a traditional audience. Or the literature may say, or you may be teaching new complex topics and that number may need to go down. So it's just evaluating the programs that you're delivering, what you feel like is reasonable but ambitious to expect, and then just kind of going from there. And then like I mentioned to Tina, utilizing the data that you're creating or collecting to then make adjustments based on what you're seeing. And that goes the other way too. So, if there's a lot of different things at play. So for example, if you have a 75% knowledge gain and you're constantly hitting 60%, then there's two things that you need to consider. Maybe your 75% is too ambitious and you need to move it down. That's one. Or maybe there's something at play that can help to improve the delivery to move it up. So it's just, you're going to constantly have an internal discussion with yourself, your colleagues, and experts in the field to try to figure out what it is. But there's not one silver bullet or one template that says you should have 75% for knowledge, 45% for behavior, and so on and so forth. It's just using your best judgment to populate those numbers.
Great. Thanks, Dr. Diaz.
Yeah. And just to kind of add on that too. So from the practice adoption, maybe you have 45% for one practice, and you think, okay, I'd rather see 2 practices adopted. So maybe you move it up to 2 practices and that number goes down to 25%. So again, just a lot of things at play, and just use your expertise and best judgment, and then just triangulate with colleagues and others to see what their thoughts are on it.
Okay, thank you so much.
Any other questions before I keep plugging along? All right. So here's another follow-up evaluation. Again, this is something that you would administer through Qualtrics. This is the structure that I like to use, or I like to teach towards agents, because on the back thing, it makes life a lot easier for you all. It's a simple yes or no. And so it gives you the percentages that you need, and it gives it a lot shorter of a user experience. So rather than having to go through and doing the pre-column and the post-column, or evaluating their level of agreement with adoption or frequency, This gives you just enough to know, hey, they attended this workshop and now they've adopted it. And I've got another question. Nope. And I like to do NA as well. I'm all for creating less surveys. So this gives you the opportunity to have kind of a one-shot survey. And if it was a practice that was not covered in the workshop that they attended, they could simply delineate NA. I've also recommended more recently too that folks incorporate an additional column that says already doing this. So if they go in and they were already, for example, making an inventory and plan for their property, rather than them selecting NA or no, which skews their data a little bit weird, you know that they went into it already doing this. And then for you and your program, you know, hey, maybe I need to hold off on doing so many programs on inventory because 75% of the folks that I followed up with said they were already doing this prior to the program. So again, I would say, what does this mean for ROAs? Because at the end of the day, it all circles back to that. So again, same structure. Not a fan for reinventing the wheel. So having the large P objective, reporting on your success for attaining that. And then as you have your small P objectives, you know, maybe you want someone who's actually calibrating their irrigation or using the right place or using a soil test. You're able to connect those to this data table and report your outcome attainment because you had those, you're collecting that data, and you have it already broken down in that way, so it makes reporting a lot easier. So we'll move into next, observing practice adoption. So I'll kind of go over what these look like within the context of large P, small p first. So annually, at least 45% of program participants will adopt at least one positive youth development practice as a result of a program activity as measured by observation checklist. So again, this will be, the only things that will change here is what you're actually looking for in regards to the practice. So we'll adopt at least one practice for creating an inclusive environment as measured by the observation checklist. So if you had, let's say, an inclusive environment half-day workshop, your follow-up would be, are they actually implementing the practices that we taught them, with the level of success being 45% in one practice? So I'll give you an example. This is a 4-H positive youth development practice checklist that we created. And this brings together some of the key practices that you would hope that a 4-H volunteer would implement as a result of an inclusive environment workshop or educational activity. So this would be, you would go and potentially observe a club meeting or whatever other salient club activity there is where you'd expect to see the volunteers creating an inclusive environment. And you would just go through this construct and identify which practices they're actually implementing. So another large P versus small p. Annually, at least 45% of program participants will adopt at least one school garden best practice as a result of a program activity as measured by observation checklist. So the things that change here will adopt at least one practice for developing a quality outdoor classroom, outdoor garden-based classroom. So this is a follow-up observation checklist that Susan Webb, the School and Community Gardens Regional Specialized Agent, created. This is a great follow-up practice adoption checklist that she created so that when she's doing her site visits for different schools in follow-up to different workshops, she's able to then see what they actually implemented as a result of that workshop. And then during that site visit, provide education so that they move them from where they are to where they need to be. So again, it helps you evaluate using observation, but then it creates an additional educational opportunity for you as you're there on site. So next one, at least 45% of program participants will report adopting at least one ag best practice. And then at least 45% of program participants will conduct a soil test as measured by a site visit checklist. So before I move into the tool, I think I've got a question. Yes, Tina, I can share that checklist. Oops. I am sorry, I'm having some technical difficulties. All right, So with this, there's our definitely site visit checklists, and you can just incorporate if there's folks that are doing a soil test, and you can tell. And what I always tell folks too is just because it's an observation checklist doesn't mean that you can't turn it into an interview protocol. So if you've gone to a site to observe a producer's test plot or whatever, you're going to a garden or a school, if you're looking for certain things that you may not be able to explicitly observe, just have a conversation with the client or the participant and ask them if they're doing some. So for this context, you could ask your participant while you're there on site if they've actually conducted a soil test. So again, what does this mean for reporting? Same construct. I like to use the same construct as when folks are reviewing your packet, they start to get used to this construct and understand what you're doing. So it makes things a little bit easier for them. They move through your packet a little bit quicker. So again, overarching, and what that looks like as a measure of success in regards to 45% and 1 ag BMP, and then broken down to the small P's and what that looks like for conducting soil tests, planting window forages, and converting to Bahia grass. So I'm going to give you guys about a minute or two, and I want you guys to think through how you can use follow-up observations to measure practice adoption within your own program, and also how you can use those follow-up in-person observations to strengthen client relationships, because I think that's something that folks forget. We're not only about delivering education, we're about building local relationships. So I'll give you about a minute or two. You just want to think through that, and then I'll have some folks share. Yes, I'll repeat that, Nicole. So just want you to think through how within your program area, how you could potentially use direct observation to measure practice adoption, but then how you could also use the in-person evaluation as a follow-up to strengthen client relationships. And I'd just be interested to see what that looked like from an evaluation standpoint, but for a client and participant development and community development standpoint. All right, and as you guys are thinking through, if you've thought through it and want to share, just go ahead and share. Otherwise, I'll just call them folks.
I'll go.
All right. Appreciate
So I put like using the site checklist when conducting site visits. This is for like on farms and producers. And then of course, making the recommendations. But then after that site visit, calling them either a few weeks after, or depending on the season, right? You could call them, you know, after the end of the season and ask if they made those recommendations, but also ask if it was successful or not. So
Yep.
If a pasture producer, you know, used a cool season forage, was it a good one or not? You know, did it work out, or was there one that worked better? And then that at least helps you gain knowledge and, you know, figuring out what cool season forage to recommend for the area.
Yep, that's awesome. And like you said, I love how you turned it into an educational opportunity. So while you're following up, you're finding out what they're doing and what was successful and not, but then also helping them better understand how to be successful. So
yeah, and they really like when you follow up with them. They're like, thanks for thinking of me.
Yeah,
you know?
exactly. So thanks for sharing. I appreciate it.
No problem.
Can I get a couple more folks to share?
I'll share.
All right.
So I'm a CS, and I was thinking, like, I do a lot of cooking classes and that kind of thing. So it's not as easy. Like, I can't just walk into their kitchen and see what they're doing. So one of the ways I like doing it, even with like health and wellness in general, is Facebook pages. And I know that might sound a little off, but like, even like right now, I'm doing the Let's Walk Florida, and they post like them walking. They post, you know, whatever they did that day, or whether it's biking or walking. I'm trying to think of the other ones they've done. I think I had somebody on a treadmill. you know, and that gives you that observation that they're actually doing the practice that you're encouraging them to do, but also gives you that environment where I can still send them messages and encourage them. Or, you know, I had one of them that was having trouble fitting a time in their day, you know, giving them recommendations of how to spread it out so they can actually fit it in.
I love that, Haley. That is an awesome example. And I think that really shows trying to be creative and measuring that practice, adoption, or behavior change without just doing what we like to do in Extension is sending a survey. So I think that's a really good recommendation for other FCS agents as they're trying to figure out how to manage online programs and also measure behavior change. And one of the things that I've seen as far as Facebook and other avenues is creating these closed groups where, you know, you may have a Let's Walk Florida close group for your county and you're able to track those, but then you also have a mechanism to encourage them, send out challenges, send out educational materials to that group that you've got engaged. So that was really cool to hear that, Haley. I appreciate it. Can I get one more person to share?
I can share.
All right, awesome. Thank you, Michael.
So Florida Sea Grant is pushing a seafood at your fingertips program during this COVID time because some people were, you know, reduction of seafood purchases from restaurants since they were closed, and commercial fishermen and commercial fish houses were struggling. So we made this recipe guide sort of in these live Facebook Live videos, and the hopes is using hashtags to see if people will repost the dishes they created from watching these programs, and we could possibly repost them just to boost their sort of their validity of participating. And I thought it was pretty neat.
Yeah, that's really cool. I like that too. So, and I think these are some of the things that we need to try to figure out from an evaluation standpoint, as you know, online is going to be a big component of what we're doing, especially within COVID. So, you know, one of the things that I would recommend both for you and Haley is just trying to figure out how to be systematic about it, so that you're able to collect data that is viewed to be rigorous among your superiors. So I think those are good spots, but I try to figure out how to create a group so that it's not everyone using the hashtag, it's those that you actually had influence over. So you're not extrapolating that your program is affecting everyone. You're saying that there's a direct connection with your participants. But that's awesome to hear these kind of creative ideas on how to make lemonade at this point in time where we're having to do everything online. So thanks for sharing, Michael. I appreciate it. So I have Tia asked the question, are pictures shared on Facebook enough to measure practice adoption? So I think on its own, it really depends. On its own, it's not going to be viewed as super rigorous. But if you can couple those observations with maybe a survey where you get a subsample and ask them if they're actually changing the behaviors, this is a measure of triangulation that we would see in research. So it's getting at the comment that I made to Michael. So if there's some systematic way where you're able to collect that data with, you know, probing for a share, or you have a certain amount of time where you're asking them to share something once a week. So for example, if you have a closed group and you have an educational program on cooking fish the right way, I don't know, and then you follow up on Friday and ask the group to share if they actually cooked fish, share the picture of it, that would in itself be enough to say, okay, well, of the 20 folks that engaged in this webinar and are part of this closed group, 18 or 10 or 12 shared a picture of a dish they created as a result of engaging in that program. So for within your context, if you did like I don't know, how to do a raised bed, for example, workshop, and you're teaching folks how to do a raised bed, and then ask them to, at the end of the week, provide their picture of the raised bed they created. You not only know, are they doing the raised beds, but then it becomes an opportunity for you to say, I don't want to say nitpick, but nitpick what they've done and provide additional education based on those pictures. So I think from an administrative standpoint, it's going to be a paradigm shift and something that's a little bit different from what they're used to, but it's part of my role and the role of other evaluation specialists to educate them on how we would leverage this on, especially in the age of online educational delivery. So, Saqib.
What an excellent in-service training, Dr. Diaz. I have a couple of questions. Actually, it's a two-part question.
All right.
First question is, what are some of the situations where we can get information and data from our external partners that would help us, do our ROAs and report outcomes and impacts?
Right. So I think that Lisa Hamilton had a perfect example of what that looks like. So she has her housing program, and within the context of that program, she's, measuring knowledge gain, and then she's measuring their, are they developing a financial plan and things of that nature, but then following up with the county who's collecting data on the amount of homes that are closed, the amount of savings that they're reporting. So that rather than her connecting or creating a new instrument and having to follow up, she's just connecting with the agency that's already collecting that data. And so she's able to make that connection with her program.
Are there any other examples from this group here? I'd like to hear something other than, what Lisa had mentioned very nicely. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, so it really depends county by county. There's a lot of different counties. So for example, for water quality work, there's a lot of different counties and water management districts that've got their monitoring stations. So there would be an opportunity to connect with that group and try to figure out over the context of 5 years, for example, that you've been doing programming in water quality, what the levels of impairment are in these different stations in relationship to where you've delivered education. So, depending on what your program area is, there's a lot of different agencies. Like again, in Polk County, we've got a group that does constantly community health needs assessments. So, the Andrea Nicolai would be beneficial for her to connect with them to try to figure out holistically how her knowledge gain and behavior change evaluations connect to their larger impact evaluations that they're doing at the county level.
Excellent.
So there's a lot of different organizations that are doing that. And I typically recommend that they connect with those or connect with a state specialist to do more of a research-based approach, because with those impacts, it takes a lot more to do it. So it would be better connect with someone who's already collecting that data, or find a state specialist to develop a research project to collect the data in a really intentional and strategic way.
So the part 2 question is actually about research specialists. We have at least one state specialist here in Mario. I often hear from specialists, extension specialists, that their work, their translational research or their applied research may result in a policy change that may take years. And they are struggling with how to document that as an impact within the first 6 years of their promotion tenure packet.
Yeah, so that's really the challenge in creating, from an objective standpoint, long-term objectives. But in looking at the overall structure of the packet, I would see that as a perfect place for a success story, where it's something that's taken a long time, but it's been driven by what has happened within the program. So if Mario's doing, research and extension work that then leads to that policy change, elucidating that within the success story, I think is really salient, because it's going to take some time, but that narrative on how the policy framework has changed as a result of this program, I think is really meaningful.
Thank you, John. I'd love to see a one-pager on this topic, because a lot of the state specialists are struggling with this.
Yeah, and that's why too, it's you don't necessarily want to create an objective that you would integrate into your program, but you want to be cognizant. So if you're 5 or 6 years into it, trying to figure out how to develop a systematic science-based approach to find out what impacts happened as a result, and what key stakeholders or key organizations you need to plug into to find out what those impacts look like.
I think that makes sense, especially if some of those impacts are qualitative and not quantitative. So that makes a lot of sense.
Exactly. And especially if you're looking at decision making within, for example, an organization, that's not something necessarily that you're going to be able to quantitatively approach. So I think I'm a big fan of mixed methodology. So you're able to get the numbers side of the house, but also some rich description on, how you've shaped the reality of decision making across the state within different organizations or collaboratives. So
great help, John. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem, Saqib. Appreciate it. Any other questions? All right. Is there anyone else that wants to share? All right. Well, if there's no one else that has any questions or want to share, I appreciate everyone's attendance on today's webinar. As I always end every webinar, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm here to be a resource to you all, so that if you have any questions, program development or evaluation wise, just shoot me an email. We'll schedule a Zoom call or just a regular call, or just go back and email, so that you have what you need to be successful in your efforts. So I hope everyone has a great rest of your day, and I look forward to touching base with all of you all soon.
Thank you.
Thanks, John.
Thank you all. Have a good one.